2-hour session documentary.
Ladies and gentlemen, fans of music and Beatle fans from across the universe, welcome to a journey through time and sound. I'm your host, Gus, and you're watching the Beatles Bible. Today, we invite you to delve into the legendary magical mystery tour recording sessions with the Beatles. Once the recording for Sgt. Pepper was over, the Beatles settled into a routine of low-key, continuous recording instead of squeezing as much into a 3-month album schedule as they had while on tour. This fit their more carefree lifestyle, but it also had an inherent lack of tension that would taint the final product. They didn't have to pay studio fees. All they had to do was find some spare time in the Abbey Road schedules and show up, regardless of what they had to record. As a result, they now spent a large portion of their time at Studio 2, not recording or even rehearsing, but writing songs. Meanwhile, the group's drug use had started to affect their judgment and decrease their level of self-criticism. Between April 3rd and 12th, 1967, Paul decided to pay a visit to his girlfriend at the time, Jane Asher, in Denver, Colorado. It was there that he had the idea for the Magical Mystery Tour. Paul explained, "When we were kids, you get on a bus and you didn't know where you were going, but nearly always it was Blackpool. Everyone would spend time guessing where they were going, and this was part of the thrill. So much of the Beatles stuff was a slight switch on a memory. In Penny Lane, the nurse and the barber and the fireman were just people we saw on a bus route, but this time they'd be with us. So we'd just heighten the reality to make a little bit of surrealism. Privately, I'd got a camera and I would go to the park and make films. We'd show our little home movies to each other and we'd put crazy soundtracks on them. I used to do a little bit of editing at home. I had a little machine and I was getting very into it. So for the next Beatles project, I thought, let's go and make a film. What a great thing to do. It was all done on whims." On the flight back to London, Paul began to plot out the context of the film as well as his theme song alongside Mal Evans. Using the circle to represent the 60 minutes of a TV special, he began planning out the film. As far as the song itself, John contributed only the lyrics as he put it in a 1980 interview. "One of our great inspirations was always the barker. Roll up, Paul claims. The promise of something. The newspaper ad that says, guaranteed not to crack, the high-class butcher, satisfaction guaranteed from Sgt. Pepper. You'll find that pervades a lot of my songs. If you look at all the Lennon McCartney things, it's a thing we do a lot. The roll up was also a reference to rolling up a joint. We were always sticking those little things in that we knew our friends would get, veiled references to drugs and to strips." The concept for the TV special, however, was not as well received as the song by John and George. Coming recently from the tragic news of losing their manager Brian Epstein, the boys weren't too keen on embarking on yet another demanding project so soon, and one that they didn't really love doing too. But regardless of the weariness, they soldiered on and let Paul lead them on this trip. But John resented Paul for it, and then minced his words later on.
But Paul made an attempt to carry on as if Brian hadn't died, by saying, now, boys, we're going to make a record. And being the kind of person I am, I thought, well, we're going to make a record, all right. So I went along, we went and made a record. I think Paul had a tendency to come along and say, well, he's written his 10 songs, let's record now. And I said, well, give us a few days, and I'll knock a few off, or something. I don't imagine the Mystery Tour was another where he'd set it up, and then he did work it out with Mal, and then he came and showed me what his idea was, and this is how it went. It went around like this, the story, and he had it all, production and...
At some point, I know John got a bit annoyed, sort of saying, Paul's sort of trying to be the leader of the group and stuff. It's possible that I was there more than anyone.
Jeff Emmerich relates, Paul showed up with a casting book that he had gotten from a film agency, and everyone gathered around, excitedly picking the actors they wanted for the character roles. Everyone had great fun going through the book, shouting out as they flipped through the pages, "Look at him! Look at her!" They were particularly amused by the photos of the fat lady who ended up playing Ringo's Aunt Jessie. "She's 4 times the size of you, Ring," Lennon said with glee. The Beatles worked on the track from April until May 1967. Biographer Hunter Davies writes, "When the Beatles arrived at the EMI studios, all they had was the title and a few bars of music. Paul played the opening bars of Magical Mystery Tour on the piano, showing the others how it would go. He gestured a lot with his hands and shouted, 'Flash, flash,' saying it would be like a commercial." As it turns out, the lyrics were set up as they went along. All Paul had initially was the roll up at the beginning. As they tried many ideas, Mal would write the ones that worked. Reservation, invitation, they've got everything you need, satisfaction guaranteed. Then they laid the basic track, Paul on piano, acoustic guitar by John, electric guitar by George, and the drum by Ringo, take 8 being the best. But a lot of trumpet overdubs would have to be recorded to achieve Paul's vision. David Mason, who had recorded the piccolo trumpet solo for Penny Lane 3 months prior, was among them. Paul, Ringo, John, George, Neil, and Mal all grabbed any old instruments that were lying about, including tambourines, maracas, and bells. Mike Pender of the Moody Blues remembers being in the studio, a few feet away from the microphone, during the recording of the vocal intro, roll up, even though he didn't sing in the song. There was no prearranged score for the brass players, either out of a lack of time or a simple neglect. Malcolm Addy recalls, Paul was humming to the musicians the notes that he wanted, trying for a long time to get his thoughts across to them. In the end, we had to send the trumpet players off for tea, while Paul and George Martin worked things out on the Studio 3 piano. According to Gary Harrod's account, he got so fed up with them not knowing what they wanted that he wrote something out for them himself. It was his idea they used. A variation between the album version and film version, which many Beatles fans may have noticed, is John's recital of the opening instrumental portion.
When a man buys a ticket for a Magical Mystery Tour, he knows what to expect. We guarantee him the trip of a lifetime, and that's just what he gets. The incredible Magical Mystery.
It's assumed that this was added only to the film soundtrack and is not regarded as an actual part of the record, as there is no indication that it was recorded at EMI Studios. Although Paul is in charge of this track, the admirable team effort is evident because John's vocals are very prominent in the harmonies. Ringo's drums, with their smashing cymbals and all, play a huge part in keeping the song alive. And the percussionists and trumpet players deserve their share of appreciation. The track demanded attention, much like the Sgt. Pepper theme before it, as if to usher in a new age of Beatle music and to get us comfortable in our seats for a magical trip. The Beatles took a 2-month hiatus from recording after wrapping up All You Need Is Love in June 1967. This was their first extended period of time off since they started Strawberry Fields Forever in late 1966. With a clear mind, they returned to the recording studio in August with Your Mother Should Know, which was a song more grounded and reminiscent of a bygone period, much like When I'm 64. Paul reveals, I dreamed up Your Mother Should Know as a production number. I wrote it in Cavendish Avenue on the harmonium I have in the dining room there. My Auntie Jen and Uncle Harry and a couple of relatives were staying, and they were in the living room just across the hall. So I just went to the dining room and spent a few hours with the door open with them listening. And I suppose because of the family atmosphere, Your Mother Should Know came in. It's a very music hall kind of thing, probably influenced by the fact that my Auntie Jen was in the house. One of the reasons Auntie Jen came down to visit me in London was to talk to me about the sin of smoking pot. Her nickname was Control, and she had been sent down by the family as an emissary. I suppose the word had got back that our Paul was going a bit wild in London, so someone needed to go and check in on him. Paul continues, speaking about the lyrics. I've always hated generation gaps. I always feel sorry for a parent or a child who doesn't understand each other, and many of our fans would have been beginning to think that their parents were just a bunch of old fuddy-duddies who had no idea about anything.
Have a good day. Skibbity toilet, Riz.
No! No!
So I'm very proud of the fact that the Beatles' output is always really pretty positive. And there's hardly anything in there that sort of says, go and screw your parents or whatever. You know, it's always pretty, let it be, hey Jude, Blackbird.
So I was advocating peace between the generations. In Your Mother Should Know, I was basically trying to say, your mother might know more than you think she does. Give her credit. Paul reportedly wanted the song to be played during the global satellite television show Our World's broadcast, but the others preferred John's All You Need Is Love. Although it was a fairly simple song, it was a pain in the ass to record since Paul felt their many attempts didn't do it justice and wanted to start again from scratch. As a result, the song was recorded, re-recorded, and re-recorded again with different arrangements and overdubs. August 23, 1967 marks the final session visited by Brian Epstein before his death 4 days later. John Temperley, the session's engineer, recalls, "He came in to hear the playbacks looking extremely down and in a bad mood. He just stood at the back of the room listening, not saying much." Regarding the melody and musical style chosen for the song, Paul continues, "Your Mother Should Know is a very simple thought really, that could have translated easily into the sort of ragtime song that was popular in my parents' era. No one thought it at the time, but we were really big fans of the music that came out of our parents' generation. We recognized the impact of the memorable melodies and the structure of so many of the songs. Something about the structure, verse, chorus, middle eight, verse, chorus, allowed those songs to last. I remember hearing my dad say that his dad had complained that his music, which was Chicago jazz, was tin can music. But it all comes back to what was popular at the time, and I suppose the word hit resonates. We were, after all, in the business of writing hits for the Beatles. You can look at the word hit in two ways, as either crass commercialism or trying to reach people. We knew that what made a song a hit before Your Mother was born was precisely what would make a hit now and in the future. I say precisely, but it's actually an intangible quality that pulls us all together. It's what makes us a worldwide community of listeners. After some rehearsal, they ran through 8 takes of the rhythm track, take 8 being deemed best. The instrumentation on these takes consisted of Paul on piano, Ringo on drums, and someone, probably George, on rhythm guitar. At the end of take 8, Paul played a simple rising 4-note piano phrase, which was then edited off of the finished product, but can be heard on bootlegs. The next job was to record the background harmony vocals, these sung by Paul, John, and George. These background vocals include the intricate harmonies that begin the song, as well as the Your Mother Should Know lyric lines sung at strategic spots in the song. Although much work was done on Your Mother Should Know by this point, shortly thereafter, it was decided that the previous sessions didn't do the song justice, and Paul wanted to start over from scratch.
Oh, good. Now I'll have to start all over again.
On September 16, 1967, the Beatles entered EMI Studio 3 to start again. They recorded 11 takes of a new rhythm track with somewhat different instrumentation and arrangement. Paul sang a God vocal while he played a harmonium. John played a jangle piano, George on bongos, and Ringo on drums, featuring a military-style snare beat at times. Take 27, which is featured on the Anthology 2 compilation album, begins with Paul mockingly addressing producer George Martin with the words,
Do you want us to do it again, George?
Okay. With Siggy in mouth.
This take was temporarily marked as best. A week and a half later, Paul decided that the original attempt at Your Mother Should Know could be saved by adding some overdubs. Therefore, on September 29, 1967, the group entered EMI Studio 2 to finish up the song. Paul overdubbed his bass part, John overdubbed an organ part mimicking Paul's piano work from the rhythm track during the instrumental sections, and Ringo added tambourine at various places in the song. What sounds like a tambora drone in the final seconds of the song was most likely played by George at this overdub session as well. With these overdubs performed, the song was complete.
I had a black carnation because they'd run out of red ones. And I said, all right, I'll have a black one out of whatever you've got. So I got this hugely significant thing of a black carnation. The Walrus was a nothing thing, not meant anything about anyone. It was very read into. And what happened was when we did Magical Mystery Tour and portrayed it, I actually put on the walrus mask. The one on that wall all swaying happens to be me with the walrus thing. We just picked up a head each. There's no thought behind it.
While most writers or commentators are eager to dismiss Your Mother Should Know as just another campy, nostalgic trip to a bygone era that Paul liked to indulge in, upon inspection we can see that in this instance, the Beatles watered down the instrumentation and added some unprecedented structuring to create a sing-along song that fits well into the group's catalog. One could even say that it resembles With a Little Help from My Friends to a greater degree than it does Paul's throwback compositions such as Honey Pie.
After Brian died, we collapsed. Paul took over and supposedly led us, you know. But what is leading us when we went round in circles? We broke up then.
We were all gutted, you know. It was a huge shock, of course, because he was like one of the people we'd known longest, you know, and huge confidant of ours, and we just knew him very well. And you know, when anyone dies like that, it's just the shock of them being wrenched out of the picture. You go, oh, I'm not going to see him anymore.
I believe it was an accident because in those days everybody was topping themselves accidentally by taking uppers and or amphetamine and alcohol.
It's your belief system gets suspended. It's because you don't want to hear it so bad. You don't know what to do with it anyway. What is it? What does it mean, you know? Our friend is gone.
In August 1967, John Lennon and biographer Hunter Davies were hanging together at John's Kenwood home in Weybridge. At the time, Davies was collecting material for an authorized biography of the Beatles when the sudden seed of inspiration for a great song came about, as it most often did from the most banal moments. We were swimming round the pool at John's house, and several streets away, you could hear a police siren going da 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 da, and John started humming this and playing with those two notes. He got that on the piano, and they had a go at that later that evening. They did a backing track and a few other things. The rhythm had stayed in his head, and he was playing with putting words to it. Mr. City, policeman sitting pretty. But he hadn't got much further. He said it would be the basis for a song, but there was no need to develop it now. It could be dragged out next time he needed a song. In the early days, John would have been quick to finish a song right then and there, like a true tunesmith. That's how John and Paul used to work then. But now, this more mature and patient Lennon worked whenever his spirit moved him, adding one line at a time. That's how I Am The Walrus was constructed. He'd written down another few words that day, just staff words, to put to another bit of rhythm. Sitting on a cornflake, waiting for the man to come. I thought he said Van to come, which he hadn't, but he liked it better and said he'd use it instead. He also had another piece of music in his head. This had started with the phrase, sitting in an English country garden. This is what John does for at least 2 hours every day, sitting on the step outside his window and looking at his garden. This time, thinking about himself doing it, he repeated the phrase over and over till he'd put a tune to it. At the time, John didn't know if the two bits of music he had were going to be the same song, which is what happened. We turned to John's longtime friend Pete Shotton to shed more light on the lyrics. One afternoon, while taking lucky dips into the day's sack of fan mail, John, much to both our amusement and surprise, chanced to put out a letter from a student at Quarry Bank. Following the usual expressions of adoration, this lad revealed that his literature master was playing Beatles songs in class. After the boys all took their turns analyzing the lyrics, the teacher would weigh in with his own interpretation of what the Beatles were really talking about. This, of course, was the same institution of learning whose headmaster has summed up young Lennon's prospects with the words, "This boy's bound to fail." John and I howled together in laughter over the absurdity of it all. "Pete," he said, "what's that Dead Dog Zai song we used to sing when we were at the quarry bank?" I thought for a moment, and it all came back to me. Yellow metacusta, green slop pie, all mixed together with a Dead Dog Zai. Slap it on a butty, 10 foot thick, then wash it down with a cup of cold sick. "That's it," John said. "Fantastic." He found a pen and commenced scribbling. The thought of school studying the Beatles' lyrics was incredibly amusing to John, not only because he hated the school system, but also because he was always considered a failure in traditional academic pursuits. So because of this letter from a student from Quarry Bank, John and Pete's original school when they formed the Quarrymen group, John, being the troll that he is, began purposefully inserting the most ludicrous imagery his imagination could conjure into the lyrics. He thought of semolina, a pudding he'd been forced to eat as a kid, and pilchard, a sardine you'd feed to a cat. Semolina pilchard, climbing up the Eiffel Tower, John wrote down, laughing. He turned to Pete saying, "Let the fuckers work that one out, Pete." The sender of the original letter to John, Stephen Bailey, received the letter from John in September 1967, which was later sold at auction in 1992. In those days, John was very inspired by Bob Dylan and purposefully wrote in an obscure way, never saying what he actually meant, but hiding many clues in the words, which more or less could be read into it. He did later call this approach artsy-fartsy crap, suggesting that this was a cowardly and pretentious way of expressing oneself. There has been more said about Dylan's wonderful lyrics than was ever in the lyrics at all. Mine too. But it was the intellectuals who read all this into Dylan or the Beatles. Dylan got away with murder. I thought, I can write this crap too. You just take a few images together and thread them together and you call it poetry. I was just using the mind that wrote in his own right to write that song. As it turns out, the lyrics weren't just scribbled nonsense, at least not underneath the surface. John explained many times in detail the hidden meaning behind some of the words. Part of it was putting down Hare Krishna. All these people were going on about Hare Krishna, Allen Ginsberg in particular. The reference to Elementary Penguin is the elementary naive attitude of going around chanting Hare Krishna or putting all your faith in one idol. Lewis Carroll was a big influence on John and Paul, especially by that time, and it shows. Paul once said that when they were both writing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Lewis Carroll was a big influence on the imagery. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds also gets a nod in the lyric. See how they fly like Lucy in the sky. John frequently added those little nods to his songs. But funny enough, the walrus imagery was completely accidental, and John made a mistake when he wanted to refer to the carpenter in Carroll's story. The walrus comes from the walrus in the carpenter. To me, it was a beautiful poem. It never dawned on me that Lewis Carroll was commenting on the capitalist system. I never went into that bit about what he really meant, like people are doing with the Beatles' work. But that wouldn't have been the same, would it? I Am the Carpenter. We saw the movie, and the walrus was a big capitalist that ate all the fucking oysters. I always had the image of the walrus in the garden, and I loved it, so I didn't ever check what the walrus was. He's a bastard, that's what he turns out to be. But the way it's written, everybody presumes that means something. I mean, even I did. We all just presumed that because I said I am the walrus, it must mean I am God or something. It's just poetry, but it became symbolic of me. What about the Eggman? John never acknowledged who the Eggman was or if there was one. For that, we turn to Eric Burden of Animals and War fame, who claims he is the real Eggman John refers to. We had some great times together, something John gave a nod to on his song I Am the Walrus. It may be one of my more dubious distinctions, but I was the Eggman, or as some pals called me, Eggs. The nickname stuck after a wild experience I'd had at the time with a Jamaican girlfriend named Sylvia. I was early one morning cooking breakfast, naked except for my socks, and she slid up behind me and crapped up an amyl nitrate capsule under my nose. As the fumes set my brain alight and I slid to the kitchen floor, she reached the counter and grabbed an egg, which she broke into the pit of my belly. The white and yellow of the egg ran down my naked front, and Sylvia began to show me one Jamaican trick after another. I shared the story with John at a party at a Mayfair flat one night, with a handful of blondes and a little Asian girl. Go on, go get it, Eggman. Lennon laughed as we tried the all-too-willing girls on for size. I think it's very possible that this stuck in John's conscience, and he eventually added it to Walrus as he would usually do. Engineer Jeff Emmerich offers a funny and fascinating perspective on when John first showed I Am The Walrus to the others at the studio. Lennon sang in a dull monotone, strumming his acoustic guitar as we all gathered around him in the dim studio light. Everyone seemed bewildered. The melody consisted largely of just two notes, and the lyrics were pretty much just nonsense. For some reason, John appeared to be singing about a walrus and an Eggman. There was a moment of silence when he finished. Then Lennon looked up at George Martin expectantly, and John said, "So, what do you think?" George looked perplexed. For once, he was at a loss for words. "Well, John, to be honest, I have only one question. What the hell do you expect me to do with that?" There was a round of nervous laughter in the room, which partly dissipated the tension, but Lennon was clearly not amused. Frankly, I thought George's remark was out of line. To me, the Beatles seemed a bit lost, as if they were looking for another place to be, a new start, and even in its raw state, I could hear that the song had potential. George Martin, however, simply couldn't get past the limited musical content and outrageous lyrics. He flat out didn't like the song. As John sang provocative lines about a pornographic priestess and letting knickers down, George turned to me and whispered, "What did he say?" He couldn't believe his ears, and after the experience the Beatles had gone through with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life, I guess he was worried about more censorship problems from the BBC. But despite George's misgivings, the Beatles were determined to work on the song, so they began running down the basic track. George Martin became even more exasperated when it became apparent that Ringo was having trouble holding the beat steady. For the first few takes, Paul played bass as usual, but then he opted to switch to tambourine, standing directly in front of Ringo, effectively acting as both a cheerleader and a human click track. In the end, Ringo gave a strong performance, but even listening to the record today, you can hear that they're distracted and that their minds are not really on what they're doing. I distinctly remember the look of emptiness on all their faces while they were playing I'm the Walrus. It's one of the saddest memories I have of my time with the Beatles. Walrus was recorded on several days in September 1967, the 5th, 6th, and later on the 27th, 28th, and 29th. In the early stages, it featured an extra bar prior to the Yellow Master Custard verse, which caused the group some problems when recording. They were supposed to play a C major 7th chord during the bar as a transition back to the verse, as heard in Anthology 2, but had trouble remembering the change. The bar was eventually removed during the editing stage. One time, when George Martin was working with John on a vocal track, he noticed, "Look, you've been singing now for about 7 hours. You're beginning to sound hoarse. Why don't we do it tomorrow?" But John said no, because he wanted to get it done that day, and that's why his voice sounds so raw on the vocal track. There was some controversy about what the choir was chanting at the end of the song. Actually, the choir sang, "Everybody's got one, everybody's got one." Got one meaning, according to Lennon, that we are all the same. However, you can't really understand what they're saying when there are 30 people, male and female, on top of 30 cellos and the rock and roll rhythm section of the Beatles. Ray Thomas and Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues also took part in this vocal overdub. The BBC radio feed, including a radio production of King Lear by William Shakespeare, was added during this last session. We did about half a dozen mixes, and I just used whatever was coming through at the time. I never knew it was King Lear until years later somebody told me, because I could hardly make out what they were saying. The filming of the Am The Walrus sequence took place just days after the song was finished, sometime between September 19th and 24th, 1967, and John went on to say it was one of his favorite Beatle tracks.
First line written on one acid trip one weekend, second line written on the next acid trip the next weekend, and subsequently filled in after I met Yoko. I was running through the house and I just typed on the typewriter, I am he as you are here as we are all together, and that was lying on the typewriter for about 3 weeks before it became a song. That was the whole song right in that line, you know? And that was an acid trip line. And it was a great effort just to put it on the typewriter, for those of you who know those kind of things. So that line was written and left on the typewriter there for 2 or 3 weeks until I went to look at it and try to work out how to make that into I had to add all that garbage about Yellow Matter Custard and all that, which is an English children's chant. Yellow Matter Custard, green snot pie, all mixed together with the dead dog's eye. Spread it on a butty, which is a sandwich, spread it on thick, then wash it down with a cup of cold sip. That was a Liverpool kid's song. Because I'd seen Ginsberg and all these people liked Dylan and Jesus going on about Hare Krishna, and it was Ginsberg in particular that I was referring to. Elementary penguin, meaning it's elementary naive attitude to life to go around just chanting Hare Krishna or putting all your faith in one idol. And that's what that line is. But those days I was more obscure, you know. So I wrote it obscurely, a la Dylan, I suppose, you know. Never saying what you mean, but giving an impression of something. And where more or less can be read into it, that's a good game. Because, you know, people...
Intentionally you did that? Oh no, you were putting that down in them.
No, but then I was playing the game too.
I see.
I thought, well, you know, they get away with this artsy-fartsy crap. You know, I mean, there's been more said about Dylan's wonderful lyrics than there ever is in the lyrics at all. And mine too, but him to take a prime example because the intellectuals that read all this into Dylan or the Beatles, and he got away with murder. I thought, well, I can write this crap too, you know.
That's funny.
You know, you just stick a few images together, thread them together, and what you call it poetry, or maybe it is, then that's poetry. But I was using the mind that wrote it in his own right to write the songs, you see, instead of separating. It was Walrus and the Carpenter.
The what?
The Walrus and the Carpenter, Alice in Wonderland. And it was only years later that I went back to check what, because I never went into that bit about what Lewis Carroll really meant, you know, like people are doing with the Beatles' work or anybody's work, or that digging into, well, Lewis Carroll was commenting on the capitalist and socialist system at the time with Walrus and the Carpenter representing social positions. It had never dawned on me anything like that. To me, it was just a beautiful poem. And then I look back after I'm the Walrus and people have gone into all this depth of what it really means and all that. It just meant nothing, you know, it's just an image. So then, but I did look back at Walrus and realize, oh, I said I'm the Walrus, but the Carpenter's the good guy in that story, apparently, right? And I am Lewis Carroll's Walrus and the Carpenter turns out to be the good guy, so I thought I picked the bad guy. You know, I should have said I am the Carpenter, but it doesn't make sense. I am the Carpenter. I am the Carpenter.
Did you do all the various layers of sound as well, and the music as well?
Yeah, the group's playing there, though.
Yeah, but
you know,
like
the doon 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 doon. I mean, that sets the whole thing. Booba, booba, booba on the piano.
Yeah.
It's all there. Even without the overdubs of the cellos and all that. Oh, that's all mine. Yeah. It actually was fantastically in stereo and all sorts, but you can never hear it on the real record. It was too much to get on. It was too messy a mix. And the live mixing of the sound effects was live BBC radio on one track, you know. So there's like 8 tracks we only had those days, right? So you're trying to make 8 tracks into 2 tracks for a stereo remix. So you have 8 tracks, and one of the 8 tracks, you know, like you got the drums on one or on 2 and the vocal on another and all that. This is the final remix, and on one track was a live radio BBC third program, the sort of heavy intellectual culture. And they were doing Shakespeare or something. I just fed in whatever lines. Meaning, had we done another mix after, you would have got another set of strange talking on the end.
Oh, but
it wasn't selected, it was selected by God, you know.
And what about, are you saying, is there smoke pot? Is that the one, smoke pot?
No, it's not. No, everybody's got one. That's what they're saying, and I had this whole choir going, everybody's got one, everybody's got one. But when you get 30 people, male and female, on top of a 30 cellos and on top of the Beatles rock and roll rhythm section, you can't hear what they're saying, but they're printed for all to see.
Everyone's got one.
They're printed in the got one, anything, you name it.
Okay.
It means we're all the same. Everybody's got one.
No smoke pot.
No, nothing about smoking pot. I wouldn't be so gross.
This pointedly expressive D major/minor tune was composed in March 1967 during the Pepper Sessions. Paul takes this overarching theme of the lonely man and develops it, much like John does in Nowhere Man, in a somewhat different but equally remarkable fashion. Similar to how he handled Penny Lane after listening to John's Strawberry Fields Forever, Paul's retelling keeps the audience somewhat mystified as to the identity of the fool. On March 29, 1967, while Paul and John were trying to finish writing a new song for Ringo to sing for Pepper, which ended up being With a Little Help from My Friends, The Fool on the Hill made its debut at St. John's Wood. Hunter Davies, who was present as well, remembers Paul showing the tune to John with his guitar as they smoked pot. When at last he finished, Hunter said, John said he'd better write the words down or he'd forget them. Paul said it was okay, he wouldn't forget them. In the end, John did like the lyrics, once saying, "The Fool on the Hill is Paul, proving that he can write lyrics if he's a good boy."
Another good lyric. It's not a John Lennon song, it's a Paul McCartney song. He's capable of writing a complete song.
Paul added,
I was writing about someone like Maharishi. Because of his giggle, he wasn't taken too seriously. I know some people think that my description of the Maharishi as a fool is disparaging. That's not the case at all. I often get the fool card doing a tarot reading, for example. I remember once hearing about a hermit who missed the Second World War because he'd been in a cave in Italy, and that always appealed to me. Saviors or gurus are generally spat upon, so I thought from my generation, I suggest that they weren't as stupid as they looked.
It is possible for every man to go deep within and saturate his conscious mind with inner happiness.
Paul relates the eventual composition of the song to his connection with his father, Jim McCartney.
He was so proud of me. He was tickled by the fact that his son was recognized. He would spot someone who had recognized me, and he would go,
"They got you, they got you."
In a strange way, it's precisely because people had got us that we were no longer able to be quite ourselves, which then left the Beatles so open to the possibilities the Maharishi offered. We needed to recenter ourselves, to get back to basics.
Although the Beatles only met their Maharishi on July 24, 1967, following his lecture in London on the same day, Paul had started penning the lyrics to The Fool by the end of March 1967, so it's likely that he had the guru in mind before then. Paul clearly had a lot of faith in this song because on April 11th, after his return flight from America, during which he had the original idea for the movie Magical Mystery Tour, he had the insight to include this unfinished song on his original pie chart for the project. The Fool on the Hill was prepared over several days, the 6th, 25th, and 26th of September, and 20th of October 1967. Jeff Emmerich remembers, "During the second night that we were working on I Am The Walrus, Paul asked me to stay late so I could record him doing a simple piano/vocal demo of a new song he had written. When he finished, he asked me what I thought, and I gave him a thumbs up through the control room window. 'That sounds like the start of a really good song,' I said. 'What's it called?' 'It's my newest one for the film. It's called The Fool on the Hill,' Paul replied proudly. It took the boys over 3 more weeks to start working on the track. Throughout that time, they were still working on other songs and filming the movie. The Beatles went into EMI Studio 2 on September 25th to continue recording Paul's new piece, featuring Paul on piano and John on acoustic guitar on the basic rhythm track, take 3 being the best. Then came the overdubs. Ray Thomas and Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues overdubbed this song, and Ray came up with the idea to use harmonicas. In the original demo showed in Anthology 2, Paul sets the tune's tonal ambiguity in a 4-bar piano opening. This was kept in the initial group recording, which can also be found in Anthology 2, but was eliminated in the final version. Later, on the 26th, the boys came back for more work on it, this time without either Jeff Emmerich or George Martin in the control room. Ken Scott took charge of the studio control room for this session, even though it was only his second day as a Beatles balance engineer. He was, understandably, a little flustered, as Richard Lush recalls. He was so nervous that it was just unbelievable. He was saying, "What lights do I use and what do I do?" I really felt for him that day. The Beatles always put a bit of pressure on their engineers. They expected you to be there doing your job, but there wasn't a lot of thanks. The video for the song was shot in Nice, France. It was spontaneously created on an unrelated trip Paul made to France and was actually not in the original plans for the film. With a small camera crew and very low budget, it turned out to be one of the most visually stunning scenes in the entire film.
You know, and I just wandered off to France and did that Fool on the Hill stuff just one morning with a couple of mates. You know, it wasn't quite union. So I said, let's just take one camera down to the south of France. I said, let's just wait till the sun comes up and I'll just goof around and I'll just sing it. And that's the footage we use now.
And I myself had started making kind of home movies. I had a 16mm Bolio camera, French camera, which was great. I used to have a lot of fun with. And I would make these films and put a soundtrack to them. And they were, I suppose you'd call them art films. So I thought, well, we could maybe try this same technique. So we did. We just got up in France very early in the morning in order to catch the sun rising. And then I just wandered around, talked to the cameraman. He said, this looks like a good shot. And then I just did various things while we played back the song. We didn't bother with sync. We didn't bother with keeping it very in time. And we didn't bother with things that proper filmmakers bothered with, like clapboards, in order to be able to synchronize the film and the sound later, which did end up as a nightmare when we got to the editing suite. It also made the whole thing very simple to do and very instinctive. So that's how it was made. The filming of Fool on the Hill sequence took the morning. Basically, we were just in the south of France for a morning. And by the time we reached noon, the lighting had moved from where we wanted it. So I think we went back to the hotel, just a bit later got on the plane, and then filmed out of the plane window to get the setting sun and the clouds.
After the intricate music of Sgt. Pepper, fans paid a lot of attention to The Fool on the Hill when it came out because it sounded so unique and cleverly made. Still, so many people overlook The Fool on the Hill, overshadowed amid the Beatles' rich catalog. But The Fool on the Hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head still see the world spinning round.
I was looking out over all the red square buildings, all this great sort of Russian scenery that I'd only ever seen in films before. And I looked up, and There was me looking over Red Square, and the sun was just going right down over that building, and the eyes in his head, and it's like, it's just me. I'm going, ah! This is happening. It's magical.
Instrumentals have always played quite a role for the Beatles. The Beatles even gave it a go in '65 during the Rubber Soul sessions with 12-bar original, drawing inspiration from the instrumental Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs from '62. However, this recording never went anywhere. Flying was an instrumental that we needed for Magical Mystery Tour, Paul reveals. So in the studio one night, I suggested to the guys that we make something up. I said, we can keep it very simple, we can make it a 12-bar blues. We need a little bit of a theme and a little bit of a backing. I wrote the melody. The only thing to warrant it as a song is basically the melody, otherwise it's just a nice 12-bar backing thing. It's credited to all four, which is how you would credit a non-song. Though it didn't exactly take the world by storm, Flying, a sleepy tune adorned with pseudo-Indian melismas and some great mellotron by John, did make the cut in Magical Mystery Tour and had some radio airplay. A lot of disc jockeys found that this ethereal tune was perfect to pass the time before the hourly news. Since there were no words, talking at the same time or pausing the song mid-song didn't seem disrespectful.
If you call me up at 555-2160 and say you won't hear anything but the Riddles, I'm gonna come looking for you. I mean it, because it's Riddles Day. They're gonna be here tomorrow talking about their trousers.
Flying received a lot of airplay due to the radio formats of the day, even though it never charted in any way. On September 8, 1967, the Beatles went into EMI Studio 3 to record Aerial Tour Instrumental, which was then the working title for Flying. Take 6 was deemed best, with Paul on bass, George on guitar with a prominent tremolo effect, John on organ, and Ringo on drums. Curiously, Take 6 was followed by 30 seconds of fast-paced traditional jazz-style recording with a saxophone that apparently came straight off one of the tapes in John's mellotron. The vocals in the third verse, which essentially only consist of la-la-las in imitation of John's mellotron section in the second verse, were then overdubbed. Jeff Emmerich reveals, Ringo's voice was the most prominent one on the chanting, and that was done deliberately because Paul wanted a different kind of vocal texture. I simply lifted out a few minutes of the best bits. They added a number of overdubs, and the song was complete. From the outset, it was always meant to be just incidental music for the film, so nobody wanted to spend a lot of time on it. One thing unites the two pieces of George Harrison's from 1967, the influence of Indian music. As he commented in Anthology, he lost interest in being fab at that point after becoming infatuated with the country and its culture. I just got back from India, George said, and my heart was still out there. His Pepper song, Within You Without You, is centered around a single note drone that essentially stayed in one chord the entire time, while its vocal melody line jumped and dipped around it. He used the same pattern in Blue Jay Way, with the melody line lingering in the key of C the entire time, although Blue Jay Way has a more western flair to it, abandoning all tablas and sitars in favor of drums, keyboards, trippy studio effects, and Beatle harmonies. In August 1967, George, his wife Patty, Neil Aspinall and Magic Alex took a plane from Britain to California, mostly to watch Ravi Shankar's Hollywood Bowl concert and see Patty's sister, Jenny. While there, Jenny, who lived in Haight-Ashbury, urged them to travel to San Francisco to see the hippie culture they had heard so much about. While they accepted this invitation, George later denounced them as bums and full of horrible spotty dropout kids on drugs. We walked down the street, George related, and I was being treated like the Messiah. I became really afraid because the concoction that the DJ had given me was having an effect. It certainly showed me what was really happening in the drug culture. It wasn't what I thought. spiritual awakenings and being artistic. It was like alcoholism, like any other addiction. George would later share his disillusionment about Haight-Ashbury with John. Prior to this, John and George were the biggest proponents of acid in the group. The Beatles shortly after would publicly denounce LSD and other drugs in favor of transcendental meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, whose seminar they attended in late August in Bangor, Wales. On arrival in Los Angeles on August 1st, they were driven to a small rented cottage with a pool on Blue Jay Way, a street high in the Hollywood Hills above Sunset Boulevard. Derek Taylor, formerly the Beatles press officer and now a publicist working in Los Angeles, was due to visit them on their first night in town. Derek Taylor revealed they'd ring and say, "We're here." So I asked him, "Where are you?" "In Blue Jay Way," he replied. "Where's that?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied. "Somewhere up in the hills." So I said to him, "Never mind, I'll ask a policeman. There are plenty of them around." So I set out to find them, and while he was waiting with jet lag and Patty, he sat down at an organ in the hall and started, "Please don't be long. My friends have lost their way. There's a fog in LA. They'll ask a policeman on the street. There's so many there to meet." By the time I had reached them, the song was virtually intact. Of course, at the time I felt very bad because here were these two wretchedly jet-lagged people, and I was about 2 hours late to meet them. "I felt really knackered with the flight," George explained, "but I didn't want to go to sleep until he came. To keep myself awake, just as a joke to pass the time while I waited, I wrote a song about waiting for him in Blue Jay Way. There was a little Hammond organ in the corner of this house, which I hadn't noticed until then, so I messed around on it, and the song came. The mood is also slightly Indian. The Hammond organ George wrote the song on is still in the Upland home at 1567 Blue Jay Way, and the owner claims that the last time he plugged it in, it started smoking. The property was up for sale for $4,599,000 in 2012. Following a lot of rehearsal, the written track, featuring George on organ, John on second organ, Paul on bass, and Ringo on drums, was captured in only one take, with overdubs of cello, backing vocals, and tambourine. Author Nicholas Schaffner describes Blue Jay Way as the first Harrison-written Beatles recording, on which he adapted some of his Indian-derived ideas to a more Western setting through the choice of musical instruments. In the arrangement, the Hammond organ recreates the drone of a tambora, while a cello acts as an Indian sarod. It was during the recording of Blue Jay Way that Ken Scott worked as a balance engineer with the Beatles, due to their previous engineer Jeff Emmerich choosing to step down at this point. Later on, Scott made it big in the 70s as a producer, working with artists like David Bowie, Supertramp, Devo, and others. Blue Jay Way was to George what, in recording terms, Strawberry Fields Forever or I Am The Walrus were to John, in that it seized upon all the studio trickery and technical advancements of 66 and 67 and captured them in one song, like flanging, audio delay effect, sound signal rotation via a Leslie speaker, and reverse tapes. The film sequence for Blue Jay Way was shot mainly at RAF West Malling, an Air Force base near Maidstone in Kent, with a scene designed to recreate a typically smog-ridden Los Angeles, featuring George sitting on a pavement and playing a chalk-drawn keyboard. The other part of the sequence, with all four Beatles, was filmed at Ringo's house in Weybridge, Surrey. Regarding the house on Blue Jay Way, George was actually not the only one who wrote a well-known song there. Paul Simon allegedly created Bridge Over Troubled Water in the same house in the Hollywood Hills, even recording percussion parts for Cecilia as well. Perhaps there's something about that house after all. No one could possibly replace Brian, was what Paul kept saying, except perhaps Paul himself. On September 2nd, 1967, only 6 days after Brian Epstein's death, Paul took the reins and set them off on a wild gallop.
But Paul made an attempt to carry on as if Brian hadn't died, you know, by saying, now, boys, we're going to make a record.
He set up a meeting with all the boys in his house to discuss their next project. The project was to be recorded, produced, scripted, and directed by the Beatles, namely Paul himself.
Or something like that. Magical Mystery Tour was another where he'd set it up, you know, and then he'd worked it out with Mal, and then he came and showed me what his idea was, and this is how it went. It went around like this, the story, and he had it all, you know, I think, production and...
A formal script was never prepared for the project. Instead, there was only an outline, sketches of dwarfs, and rewarmed Fellini characters out of Paul's comic strip imagination.
I ended up kind of directing it, even though we said, well, the Beatles had directed it at the end. Just because I was there most of the time, and all the late-night chats with the cameramen about what we're going to do tomorrow would tend to be me rather than the others.
The project was a mess. If Brian had been alive, it never would have happened the way it did. On September 11th, a 60-seat yellow and blue coach, festooned with signs identifying it as the Magical Mystery Tour, took off for Devon and Cornwall with a cast and crew of 43 aboard. Following them was a procession of carloads of Fleet Street reporters, plus 10 or 15 fans in their own cars. The Magical Mystery Tour stopped in Devon, where they hoped to find a Devon fair, but found only a town. The local constable chased them off for disturbing the peace. When they stopped for a lunch break, they discovered they were 30 lunches short to feed the cast and crew. The first night on the road, the sleeping accommodations had been underbooked, and Paul and Neil spent hours sorting out fights between fat ladies and dwarfs who didn't want to share rooms. Heading north the next day, their caravan caused mayhem and traffic jams wherever they went, not just because of the procession of cars that followed them, but because a line of cars now preceded them for a mile. Unable to take another second of it, John ordered the bus to stop, stormed out the door, and ripped the signs of the coach in fury. They should have filmed that, Neil barked.
And then George and I were sort of grumbling, you know, movie, you know, well, we better do it, you know, a feeling that we owed the public, or owed somebody other, that we should do these things, you know. So we made it, you know.
We knew we weren't doing a regular film. We were doing a crazy, roly-poly 60s film where I am the Eggman, you were the...
Paul had planned to shoot the finale, a top hat and cane dance number, at Shepperton Studios outside of London, but no one had thought of booking time on the soundstage. In desperation, they leased an old airfield in West Malling, Kent, where a huge set was built. Paul took all the developed footage and disappeared into an editing room he'd hired on Old Compton Street to piece it together. Each Beatle had a say about the film, and it was edited, re-edited, and tinkered with 1,000 times. Often, it was changed back and forth 4 times in the same day, with Paul contradicting John's suggestions of that very morning. One day, Peter Brown received a phone call in his office on the Beatles' private line. It was Paul. "Where are you?" Peter asked. "I'm in Nice, France," Paul said, "with the camera crew. We found the perfect hill, but we haven't brought the right lenses. Do you think you could have them shipped out to us, along with some money?"
You know, and I just wandered off to France and did that Fool on the Hill stuff.
Peter was baffled. "France? Perfect hill? What are you talking about? How can you be in France? I have your passport." Paul explained that he wanted to include a scene in the film of him standing on a picturesque hill and singing The Fool on the Hill. He took off to France without telling anybody and bluffed his way past the English authorities at Heathrow, saying his passport was waiting for him in France. By the time Paul and crew returned to London, it had cost £61,000 just for the one shot of him sitting on a hill in Nice.
I mean, the scene that, to me, that stands out is the one of John shoveling the spaghetti onto the fat woman's plate. I mean, that was the best bit of the movie for me.
All this mad. In 45 minutes, I can hardly get my breath.
That was an actual dream he'd had. And so he'd come in, you know, and he'd sort of say, "Hey, I had this wild dream last night. I'd like to do it. I'm a waiter." You know, and so we just put them in, you know, and it was very haphazard, you know, looking back on it, it's how you learn kind of thing, by your mistakes, you know. But I think, you know, in the end, it came out, I think it's quite interesting now looking back on it as a period piece. And people like Spielberg, I've read that people like him have sort of said, when I was in film school, that was a film we really took notice of. like an art film, you know, rather than a proper film. But of course, we then released it.
When the Magical Mystery Tour was finally finished, Paul screened it for everyone at NEMS. The reaction was unanimous. It was bad. It was formless, disconnected, disjointed, and amateurish. Peter Brown told Paul to junk it. So what? We lost 600,000 pounds. Better to junk it than be embarrassed by it. But Paul's ego wouldn't let him consider this. He was positive that the Magical Mystery Tour would be as warmly greeted by the public as the Beatles products that came before it. The rights were sold to the BBC, which put them on the air on December 26th, Boxing Day in England, when millions of Britons were at home celebrating the holidays.
Talking about your magical mysteries, I spent half an hour looking for that sugar, I tell you. Alright, any news of the bus?
The bus. It's 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road.
Really?
And they're having a lovely time.
They're having a lovely time!
And of course, they showed it in black and white. And so it was hated. You know, they all had their chance then to say they've gone too far. Who do they think they are? What does it mean?
The critical reaction was truly remarkable. The press was so mean and vindictive that, for the first time in memory, an artist felt he had to make a public apology for his work. In an effort to explain the group's creation, Paul gave a TV interview to David Frost.
Top of the evening. Good evening, Mr. Frost. Good evening, Mr. McCartney. Why don't you think that the critics liked this film?
I don't know, you know. They just didn't seem to like it. I quite liked it myself.
Well, I liked it. I saw it. I didn't see it last night because I was a bit busy, but I saw it today, and I liked it. I mean, with reservations and so on. But I mean, why were people so puzzled by it? Do you think?
I think they thought it was bitty, which it was a bit. You know, but it was supposed to be like that. I think a lot of people were looking for a plot, and there wasn't one. But we thought that we could just do a thing. You see, we've been waiting for a couple of years now to make another feature film. And we've been asking people to write stories and write plots, in fact, targets. But nobody's come up with one, you know. So we thought we would do something which isn't like that, you know, which isn't like a real film in as much as it's got a story and a beginning. We'll just do a selection of, you know, we put together a lot of things that we like the look of and see what happens. I liked it.
Did you have a point in mind when you? Some point to get across at all when you did this?
No, that's the trouble. It seems that you've got to do everything with a point or an aim, but we tried this one without anything. You know, with no point, no aim. It's like, you know, we make it a record album, and all the songs don't necessarily have to fit in with each other. You know, they're just a selection of songs. But when you come to making a film, I don't know, you seem to have a thread to pull it all together. Well, we thought that doing a mystery tour, you know, it all happens on a bus to this group of people, would be enough of a thread. And then calling it a magical mystery tour, which is like a firm advertises a magical mystery tour, and you go on it, and it really is magic. Then anything might happen there, and it wouldn't have a thread if it was magic. If you watch it the second time, on January the 5th on BBC, if you watch it the second time, it does grow on you, you know. And this is one thing we forgot, because when you make a record, a lot of people listen to our records and say, well, I don't like that one, you know. But the second time round, they say, well, it's not bad. And then after a few plays, they say, you know,
but are the BBC going to show it 17 times?
Yes. They have just signed the thing, yes.
Today?
Yes.
Is the fact that it didn't get across to a lot of people, does that fact alter your opinion of it? Do you say, right, it seems to have failed, or do you still think it's precisely as good as if people had said it was very good?
Yeah, I think it's as good, you know, as I always thought it was. But when we were making it, I think all of us thought, well, this has got a very thin plot. You know, we hope this idea of doing a thing without a plot works, because the one thing we're going to be able to say is it hasn't got a plot. But, you know, we thought you don't need a plot. You don't always need one, you know, because, like, the things you did today probably didn't have much of a plot. So...
Oh, that's plotting all day.
Yeah.
But, no, I can see that. But would you call it a success or a failure?
It's both, you know, it's a success failure, you know. You can't say it was a success, you know, because the papers didn't like it, and that seems to be what people read, you know, to find out what's a success. But I think it's all right. You know. I think the next one will be a lot better, and it'll have a fat plot.
Since the critical reaction in the UK was so negative, the Beatles didn't even bother to try to distribute it in the United States. It was not well known to many American fans until around 10 years later. That being said, fans have come to accept the Magical Mystery Tour movie much better as time went on, and it gained somewhat of a cult following. Even though it obviously has its flaws, a lot of people love it or see it as a guilty pleasure. But while the US didn't know about the movie, they did know about the music. The Beatles went to tremendous lengths to record 6 great psychedelic songs for the movie soundtrack when the music of Sgt. Pepper was still echoing through the EMI studios. But 6 tracks were obviously not enough to make an album to follow Pepper, and they were too busy making the movie to write more. So because EPs were still a common format in Britain at the time, it was agreed that the 6 songs would be issued as a double EP to go along with the movie. But this wasn't the case in America, where the few Beatle LPs that were issued didn't even reach the top 40. Simply put, America didn't buy EPs. So Capitol smartly decided to release an album instead, using the 6 tracks on the EP as side 1 and the 5 tracks they released as non-album singles that year as side 2. The LP came complete with a new cover, a greatly packaged fold-out album cover, and a 24-page booklet featuring the Beatles in a variety of poses, as well as storyboard cartoon comics that tell the story of their mysterious journey. Over time, this LP version became even more popular and well-known, not only for the track listing, but for the cover too. Even though the original was the EP, Beatle fans today mostly agree that this is the definitive version of Magical Mystery Tour.